Steinberg, your mayor. Happy Earth Day to everyone. I want to thank the Sacramento Bee again for working with my office and allowing us to use your Facebook Live page to speak to the people of Sacramento. Tonight, we want to talk about Earth Day. We want to talk about climate change, and we want to talk about its relationship to COVID-19. I'm going to introduce some special guests in just a few moments, but let me begin by making a few brief comments about why it is important in the midst of this pandemic to actually focus on the other public health crisis of our time, and that is the climate catastrophe that threatens us not just today, but for the long term. In the midst of this terrible pandemic on Earth Day, there is a peek into what the world could look like. Stanford University released a study over the last couple of days that says the country may experience a 5% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in calendar year 2020 because people obviously are staying home, are not flying, are not driving as much, more people are telecommuting. Compare that 5% projection with the 1.8% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions during the height of the financial crisis. Good news. In January and February, China, of course, which where much of the events of the last couple of months started, their emissions dropped 40% in January and February compared to the same period of time in 2019. That 40% drop is the equivalent to reducing the number of cars on their roadways by nearly 200,000 cars. The question for us in this country, in the world, and in our community is, will this last after the coronavirus crisis passes? There is another side, of course, to the correlation between climate and COVID that is not nearly as hopeful. Harvard School of Public Works and Public Health recently published another study that estimated a 15% increase in the death rate associated with people who live in communities that have higher levels of what's called PM 2.5, small particulate matter that easily gets in the lungs, 15%. We know that air pollution itself kills 7 million people in the world a year. Another study over the past couple of weeks from the Federal Centers for Disease Control says that 30% of COVID-19 patients are African American, whereas African Americans represent 13% of the country's overall population. The COVID-19 crisis is exacerbating inequities in our society and in our community, of course, that already exist. In New York City, the epicenter of the crisis, African Americans are dying at twice the rate of their white peers. Latinos in New York City are dying at a higher rate than their white peers as well. This is very disheartening, but it probably should not come as a surprise because systemic inequities, including pre-existing fragile health conditions among communities of color, closer physical proximity to polluters and to pollution, and jobs which put people largely at the front lines of being exposed to viruses like COVID-19, put people of color at greater risk. And similar to what we know about the climate crisis, these health public policy challenges have a much greater impact on our communities of color. What are we doing here in Sacramento? That's what we want to talk about here this evening. And before I introduce our guests, I just want to give you a little bit of foundation for the work that we are going to share together tonight. A year and a half or so ago, the mayor of West Sacramento, my friend Christopher Cabaldon and I commissioned the Climate Commission that is representative of both the city of Sacramento and the city of West Sacramento, comprised of 19 people representing all of the stakeholder communities from business and labor, community-based organizations, leaders of our diverse communities, to tackle the key questions. How can Sacramento and West Sacramento be state and national leaders on the fight to improve our climate? And how can we integrate economic opportunity, economic growth, economic inequity, and the drive to improve the climate together so that we don't create the often false choice that if you do one, you do not get the other. I want to bring now into the stage, so to speak, onto the stage, 4 members of our Climate Commission who are going to share some thoughts with us tonight about what Earth Day means to them. What does the Sacramento Climate Commission recommendations consist of? Why is it relevant to COVID-19? And why is it important to the future of our community? Let me introduce, first of all, April Wick, who is the Executive Director of Resources for Independent Living and the co-lead for the Climate Commission's Equity Technical Advisory Group. April, welcome to you.
Thank you, Mayor.
So glad to have you here. Let me also introduce Stephanie Bray. Stephanie is the CEO of the Greater Sacramento United Way and the co-lead for the Climate Commission's Equity Technical Advisory Group, with expertise in environmental justice and how to build stronger communities. Welcome to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Mayor. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Jose Bodipo-Memba, who's the Director of Sustainable Communities for the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. SMUD, of course, is a leader, both necessarily, but also by spirit, intent, and action on Sacramento's leadership to achieve a better climate. And Jose is in the center of that. It's presented to the commission, and we welcome you as well.
Thank you, Mayor Steinberg. Appreciate it.
Welcome to you. And last but not least, let me bring on James Corless. James is the CEO of the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, which is a multi-county governance body that is responsible for many things, but including helping to establish and then implement the region's climate goals throughout the state of California. And James is the director of our region's Council of Government and is another leader in the fight for climate improvement. James, welcome to you.
Good to see you, Mayor.
So let me begin by asking all of you, and since we do have 4 articulate people here tonight, I would ask you if maybe we can keep the answers relatively short so we can get through a lot of topics here. James, I wonder if you might start, or Stephanie might start, maybe break it down a little bit, or April, any of you, and give just a brief summary of what the Climate Commission's recommendations consist of. James?
Sure, happy to start, and thank you again for your leadership, and of course, West Sacramento Mayor Cabaldon. This, I think, is we had not planned on this disaster that we're currently in the middle of with the pandemic, but we do believe we have some time on the climate emergency and pending disaster, as you say. Your challenge to us as the commission was to try to figure out how do we get to carbon zero by 2045. Ideally, as my daughter reminds me, is 15, even sooner. Ideally by 2030. And one of the ways that we've been focused on, and of course with our work at SACOG, is around transportation. So as we think about the pandemic, but getting out into economic recovery, as you're saying with the statistics you read off, how do we actually get some of these habits around, say, telecommuting? How do we get some of these habits to stick that are greener? How do we get a greener recovery that can truly benefit every single person in Sacramento? So we, the commission, one of the buckets that they've been really focused on is greener transportation, cleaner transportation, that frankly can benefit the folks that actually have to pay the most out-of-pocket, disadvantaged communities. So let's not recover maybe to the old ways of doing business and moving people around, but some cleaner and greener ways to do that.
Very good. Let's hear from Stephanie. Why don't you add a little bit to some of the substance of what the commission is recommending, and will take up for final adoption next month.
Well, thank you, Mayor. First of all, thank you for the opportunity. As a commissioner, I thought it very important to, one, learn from some of the challenges that other cities experienced, and we learned about that during our first commission meeting. And in particular, around making sure that we reach communities that are most impacted by climate change and that bear the greatest burden. And they tend to be communities of color. I mean, as you so eloquently expressed in your opening, people of color tend to experience the greatest challenges as a result of climate change, whether it's because of the particulate matter in the air and the effect on asthma, which we know occurs at a higher rate in people of color, and in particular children of color who live in poverty, whether it's the climate shifts themselves during the summer, where the temperature is extraordinarily hot and there may not be tree canopy in certain neighborhoods. I mean, all of these things we believe need to be addressed if we are all going to have an impact on improving our climate and reaching those climate goals. And so it was important for us as the equity TAC to really make sure that we understand, first of all, what those communities are experiencing, and then also hear from the community members themselves that are experiencing that burden. And as you can imagine, it's been quite extraordinary to hear. And we felt, April and I and a number of other commissioners felt it important to really elevate the issue of equity and make sure that everything that we do going forward is centered in equity so that we can meet the needs of those who are experiencing the burden the most. And if we can do that, then all of us will benefit.
Thank you. Now, the recommendations are going to be subject to a lot of public comment and hopeful debate over the next month. And then in many months after, as the recommendations go to the respective city councils of Sacramento and West Sacramento, include very ambitious goals. For example, to ensure that all buildings are constructed with electric energy.
Yes.
Are electrified new buildings by 2023, and that all existing buildings are electrified, are changed by 2030. Very aggressive goals around ensuring that high percentages of Sacramentans are using walking, biking, and our public transit with aggressive goals that ramp up over the course of a number of years, and a number of policy recommendations about how to achieve those key objectives. April, from an equity perspective, what were the highlights and the important conclusions that the commission made around how ensuring that all of this work is accomplished in a way that is inclusive of all people and all neighborhoods?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, we wanted to make sure, as Stephanie so eloquently stated, that the communities were reflected in these final recommendations. And so what you see with our final report is that we wanted to make sure that the commission took into account that a lot of these communities feel like things are being done to them. And so, the disability community has a slogan called "Nothing about us without us." And so the equity recommendations and the final report really took into account that we wanted to find out from the communities, don't just tell us where the tree canopy is going to go. Don't just tell us how, your disaster resilience strategy is going to go. Let us inform you with our lived experience. And so you'll see throughout the report, it's peppered with, a lot of really ambitious goals, such as, arming communities of color and people with disabilities, for example, with disaster resilient strategies, and really going into the communities, finding out who are the cultural brokers, who are the leaders in those communities, so that we can find out, from them, let's shape the world from their perspective. Because when you plan for the most vulnerable, everybody wins, as opposed to planning for people at the top and then having the most vulnerable react to it.
Very good. Thank you. I want to turn it to James for just a moment to describe the relationship between these recommendations and the region's legal goal, legal imperative, the 19% goal to achieve a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions among a region, what that's about, and how these recommendations relate to that region goal.
Yeah, absolutely, Mayor Steinberg. As you're referencing, the state of California, partly under your leadership when you were in legislature, partly all the way back to Governor Schwarzenegger back in the early 2000s, we've got some of the most ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals of any state in the nation. We here in the 6-county region have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions 19% per capita by 2035 off around mobility, around all transportation sources. So there is no one way we're going to have to do that, but we're going to have to provide as many people as possible affordable housing near jobs, so that they don't have to commute an hour and a half every day. We're going to have to provide not just really good public transportation options, but clean, electric, zero emission public transportation options. And frankly, as the commission has highlighted, imagine mobility hubs. As April and Stephanie were saying, imagine these mobility hubs in the disadvantaged communities where you could walk and get a jump bike, electric car, you can get on a bus or a train, easy, seamlessly, affordably, and get to where you need to go, really safely, quickly, affordably. We need this all over the region. So all the 6 counties have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. Your city and West Sacramento are really trying to put a stake in the ground to say, this is our contribution.
Thank you, Jose. Let's get you into this conversation here, because SMUD is, of course, a crucial stakeholder known for its great reputation providing reliable, affordable electricity and energy to the people of Sacramento. But talk, if you would, for a minute about SMUD's role and the way it sees climate change.
Thank you, Mayor Steinberg. Again, as a public utility, SMUD has a commitment to community. And it's our perspective, again, that climate change has, as everyone else has mentioned, a disproportionate impact on our underserved communities. SMUD's trying to be very aggressive and intentional in our approach. We have our integrated resources plan, which is trying to meet those 2040 goals that James referenced before. And we're leveraging a lot of the data we have that this group has put forward and data from our resource map we'll be releasing actually next week to make sure that those investments go into underserved communities to ensure that that disparity gap doesn't increase. So from our perspective, we see our role as being a leader in this process overall and teaming with folks like yourselves at the city in providing a collaborative approach to making sure our entire region reaches those goals together. Because from our perspective, if we don't really be intentional in those communities that are already under-resourced, that disparity gap that we've discussed over time will continue to grow. So we have to play active role in the process. And electrification and EVs will be a big part of closing that gap.
Is it possible to electrify all new commercial and governmental buildings in Sacramento by 2030?
I'll have to actually defer on that one to our board to be able to answer those specific questions. What I can say is we want to make sure that everyone has access to electrified buildings to the best degree feasible. I mean, one thing we're hearing from this COVID crisis, number one, is how we make sure that we deal with the most core needs. And that is, as Stephanie mentioned, clean air to reduce the asthma conditions and what we can do in that perspective. And electrification of vehicles, I think, is really the number one driver in addressing that issue. but definitely electrified buildings is a goal for us.
Okay. So let me summarize here for just a little bit in terms of the Climate Commission has put out a set of recommendations here that address our physical infrastructure and how we build in a way that is clean, how we continue to lead on clean, advanced mobility, and look what Sacramento has already begun doing with its jump bikes and scooters, and with its gig cars, and the $44 million grant through Electrify America, and to ensure that everything we do to try to meet carbon neutrality no later than 2045 is done in a way that is genuinely equitable, that it not only does not hurt our communities of color, but that it actually advances people's lives everywhere in our community. And so people listening to this might say, okay, I get that it's Earth Day. I get that it's the 50th anniversary, but we're in the midst of another pandemic here, COVID-19. Why is this relevant tonight to the public health crisis that we are facing in real time? Let's go around. Stephanie?
Well, it's all of these things are inextricably linked. When you're breathing bad air, when you have no relief from the heat, when your water is polluted, I mean, all of these effects of climate change affect our health. And especially within communities of color, we have heard, and Mayor, you cited, the adverse impact and the overwhelming burden that people of color are experiencing as a result of this crisis. And it's because of those underlying health issues and because of the disparities, the health disparities that exist. And so for me, it's a no-brainer that climate change and what we're experiencing through the COVID-19 crisis are connected. And until we can address the climate change issue, and until we can clean our water, clean our air, make sure that people have what they need to sustain themselves through some kind of environmental crisis, then we're going to continue to struggle. And I know that we're an innovative country. We can do more than one hard thing at a time. And I just remind myself of that. That's what makes our country what it is. And it's time now more than ever for us to step up and to do those hard things so that we can have a better earth. We can have cleaner air. We can have people living longer and having better health outcomes.
So if you're living in a low-income neighborhood in Sacramento and you ask the question, how's this going to make my life better? With all of this fancy talk around jump bikes and gig cars and electrification and all the things that we're talking about, GHG reduction, how's it actually day to day going to help my life if we achieve these goals? April, you want to try that one?
No, absolutely. So I really see this as an invitation to create the livable community that includes everyone. And so, I run an organization where the typical client is a non-white male making less than $12,000 a year. And he probably is the person sitting at home asking himself, how are these big ideas going to touch me? And that is exactly why we need to have an equity lens as we're conducting this work, because, the hard work is ahead of us. Even though it was a lot of hard work for the last year and a half, the equity recommendations and the overall recommendations was the easy part. Now it comes to meaningful engagement with these communities, identifying who the leaders are, building them up, building our nonprofits capacity who are in those communities, and really speaking to people by making sure that the people that are going into those communities and doing the talking are reflecting those communities, and they see themselves in the people talking to them, and that they are the people talking and being in the leadership roles. And so I think the key is engagement, and meaningful engagement is how we're going to achieve this. And I think that, the COVID-19 crisis, if my clients' lives were already, on the brink of some pretty disastrous consequences before the crisis, and now it's even more heightened. And so that's why we need to not rest. We need to be vigilant, and we need to pay attention to what our environment is telling us and what these consequences are telling us. That, if we could create a community, where people who are homeless, can be inside, or, people with disabilities can, easily navigate their communities and have jobs and have economic empowerment, then when these pandemics hit, you'll have the resilience to help combat it, as opposed to, oh no, we didn't plan for the ventilators. We didn't plan for, people to have equal access to housing. Now what are we going to do? We have to own this, and we have to see this as an invitation to grow our resilience. And it has to be a resilience that represents everyone.
Jose, why is climate change a public health issue in addition to being a key environmental issue?
It's a great question, Mayor Steinberg, and I think you led off the conversation perfectly. Is when folks start to see the correlation between health, environment, and quality of life, they're all connected. And the reality is, if folks realize that students' attention spans are impacted by the air quality that they breathe inside and outside, if folks realize that even as we speak right now, as we're quarantined in some cases at home, that there's some folks who cannot walk outside to just get some fresh air from safety concerns, we start to now realize how they're all connected, and it is all about mental and physical health, and it's connected to climate change, and it's connected to safety. And as Stephanie mentioned before, they're all interrelated. And as April mentioned, we really need to be able to help folks draw that connection, because a lot of times folks who are in the most undesirable situations are trying to deal with what's right in front of them, and they aren't necessarily seeing that connectivity. And I think that all of us here, as a part of this call and the groups we represent, are doing a good job of that. And this is an opportunity to hopefully take a negative in COVID-19 and turn it into an opportunity to improve our quality of life. So that's why I'm really excited about what we've been doing in terms of connecting that climate conversation to health, because our goal right now is to make sure that folks have the ability to have better asthma conditions so that they aren't susceptible to COVID-19 or the next potential pandemic. So it's all connected. And again, I'm really proud of the task force for taking that head on and being very intentional about it in your leadership and Mayor Cabalden's.
Thank you. So James, you are the CEO of a regional organization that is not all of one mind when it comes to politics. The region is very diverse in terms of its point of view on a lot of these issues. How do we all, as leaders and advocates, do a better job of connecting climate change to public health, to economic inequity, and to the lessons that we are all learning in real time about the COVID-19 crisis? Because this is certainly a public health crisis, COVID-19, that knows no artificial or political boundaries.
It's a great question. As you say, I'm proud to work in a region as diverse as this in terms of race, in terms of background, but in terms of politics too. Our charge in the 6 counties is to bring people together, regardless of their political persuasion. Two things I'd say on this, Mayor Steinberg. One is, as you were talking about, how do you get this to be meaningful? The climate crisis might feel a little further away sometimes for some people, but we're in one of the worst economic shocks, and we will be for some time now because of this. The fact of the matter is, housing is the #1 cost for households, any family. Housing is #1. Transportation is #2. If we can lower that transportation burden, and by the way, it's about half, a third to a half for higher income families. It's up to 90% for lower income families. So you're paying more because those costs are fixed. If we can get that transportation dollars and we can get you clean shared mobility that can get you around without actually having to own multiple vehicles, we're putting money back in your pocket. If we can say to the college student, don't buy a car to come to college, we're putting money back in your pocket. That's real cash. If I can talk to a lot of my electeds around the region, and they may say to me, you're never going to get me out of my car. And I say, well, I don't have to, because what we're doing is building affordable housing and jobs in your community so that your residents don't have to travel as far and pay as much money and spend as much time. They understand that, right? So it's the co-benefits of a lot of these strategies, which frankly, again, in the economic, the shock that we're going to be in the months ahead and the years ahead, perhaps, this is going to be more important than ever.
A few more questions and then we'll wrap it up. The skeptics, of course, all will say, hey, we're now at the very beginning of an economic recession. In rebuilding, we ought to do that which is the least expensive to rebuild, and doing all this highfalutin climate stuff is just going to be too expensive. Obviously, I'm asking this in a rhetorical way because I don't agree with the premise of my own question. But what do you say to those skeptics, and what do you say about the opportunity to build a new green inclusive economy here in the city of Sacramento, in the city of West Sacramento, and beyond throughout our entire region? Stephanie?
Well, I really think it's a false choice. And I think that one of the things I'm most proud of, the work that we've been doing in the Equity Tech, is really opening up that conversation and having community members be part of that discussion so that it doesn't become a false choice. It's making sure, and back to your point about connecting it to what really matters to people. And when you do that, you create that sense of urgency. You really do. It becomes elevated, just as concerns about whether or not they're going to have a meal that day, or whether they're going to be able to make their mortgage or their rent payment, whether they're going to be able to get to work. I mean, all of those things. And so I think it's a false choice. I will also say that we will either pay for it now or we will pay infinitely more later. And that's another message that I think that we need to keep reinforcing to folks, that there is still an opportunity for us to address the climate crisis and create economic opportunity and provide the right kinds of job training and be able to retrofit spaces. We still have a chance, but that window is closing. And it's too dangerous for us not to move.
Jose, I want to give you a chance real quickly to talk about one of the real economic opportunities we have around the clean green economy, and that is the planned California Mobility Center. Can you talk just a little bit about that and what it represents in terms of climate, but also in terms of economic opportunity?
Definitely. SMUD's really happy to be helping lead that effort. And I know our CEO, Arlene Orchard, is 100% behind the concept and has put his money and put our money where our mouths are regarding the California Mobility Center. And the idea, again, to create jobs, not just in the mobility hubs themselves, but in the technology and the policies associated with future mobility, can really raise the economic value of this entire region. And we've been really intentional in identifying locations in underserved communities to start that mobility center concept and turn that into reality. So it's really could be a game changer for our region and creating an entire new economic center that starts here in Sacramento and really spreads to the entire world, to be a leader right here and create jobs and also create better behaviors, as James mentioned before. Because the reality is, if we're able to place the mobility center jobs in locations that are currently underserved, like James mentioned before, now folks have the ability to walk to work, use rideshare, improve air quality while increasing their own income, which provides better choices and opportunities for themselves and their children. So to me, the mobility center is just one of the really great examples where SMUD's all in, and the rest of the community is all in as well. And again, Mayor Steinberg, I think that we have to look at every one of these challenges as an opportunity to grow. And even though we can't necessarily solve them all at once, over time, understanding that connectivity and the mobility center is a key component will really help the entire region and help everybody's quality of life.
So April, 10 years from now, if we're looking back, what do you want us to be able to say is the most important thing we accomplished as a result of the bold recommendations made by the Two Cities Climate Commission?
You know, looking back 10 years from now, I've actually thought about this. You know, what am I going to say to my kids, you know, when they ask me about being a part of this? And I want to be able to tell them that we prioritized the people whose voices that we have historically not prioritized in the past, and that we stepped up, we heard the call, and that we got together as a community and we owned our mistakes, and we had those bold, brave, really uncomfortable conversations that we needed to have, and that we were on the path 10 years later, that we're on the path to, you know, meeting the goals that we set, and that we're almost there, and that we were on track, and that we have created a community in which everyone in Sacramento's region feels like they have have skin in the game, and that their lives mattered to the people in power, and that their lives mattered to me. And that's why I put in the work that I put in the last year, and that we're actually going to do this, that we're actually going to be, you know, carbon neutral by 2045.
And some, especially young people, are encouraging us to move up that deadline from 2045 to 2030. And so maybe we ought not to be wholly satisfied with 2045 as a goal. Closing comments, if you would, maybe to answer the question, where does this go from here? The commission's made these recommendations. By the way, they are articulated in detail, I know, in a Sacramento Bee story that posted online today. You can certainly look at that. We will have the full draft commission report on our website and all our social media platforms. And you can look at this in detail, again, broken down into how we build going forward, how we create a transportation system and network that is clean and green going forward, and about how we build out our communities over time to ensure that people do not have to get in single occupancy vehicles and drive long ways from home to work, or from home to shopping, or from home to where you seek entertainment. And it's multifaceted. All of it seeks to get us to, again, this goal of carbon neutrality by no later than 2045. But where does this go from here? We adopt the recommendations. The city council will hopefully incorporate these recommendations into their laws and specific plans. But from a community perspective, what is it going to take once the commission's formal work is done? Let's go around the horn, and we'll make that the closing comments. Stephanie?
Well, I would say it's certainly going to take all of us. And by that, I mean community members, legislators, nonprofit leaders, for-profit business, any person that has a stake in this. We need to be sitting at the table, having the conversation together and co-creating those solutions, so that it's not being generated from the top down, but rather we're all contributing to the dialogue at the community level, at the government level, again, for-profit business, nonprofit organizations, because that's what it's going to take. And as April said, you know, we all have skin that we need to put into this game if we are all going to benefit and reach those goals. And so that's what I'm looking forward to most, because remember, you know, the communities that are bearing the most burden have had to be innovative just in order to survive. And so imagine if we were to harness that resilience and have them sitting with us, coming up with those solutions together, then not only will we have a greater chance of success, but it'll be sustainable. And we will hit those goals much sooner.
Thank you. April?
I think that to build on Stephanie's point, we're going to have to, each of us, take a look at ourselves and perhaps, analyze what has our privilege been in previous conversations. What has my footprint been? Am I somebody in a position of power who maybe needs to take a step back and give the microphone to, that person I mentioned earlier who makes less than $12,000 a year, but who has really good grassroots organizing skills, and give them a job to lead this team? Am I someone who's a business owner who hasn't thought about, going green, or, using eco-powered vehicles, things like that. And so I think, we're all in this together. It's going to take, as Stephanie mentioned, a partnership between government, nonprofits, and community leaders and ordinary individuals. And within that, we all need to take a look at how some of us need to do a step back and some of us need to do a step in, and we need to lift each other up and look around the room when we do those community organizing nights, when we're trying to figure out what to prioritize, and think, who's not here, and why aren't they here, and how do we get them here?
Thank you. Inclusion. Absolutely. James Corless?
Yeah, thanks. I think there's two things. One is we're going to hear more and more about economic recovery and even things like an infrastructure stimulus. And so the first thing we have to do is to not just go back to the old ways of doing business. We can't just rely on all the old ideas and in some ways rebuilding the way it was. And then secondly, really to really build on and praise Steph and April's points. I'm a recovering transportation planner. One of our biggest sins is we think we have all the answers. What if we had kind of community neighborhood mobility plans? What do we put resources in to communities and actually and had them develop the systems of mobility? I think it's really exciting. One thing that is going to be really important in this is some really good, quick planning grants. I think that could be neighborhood and community based to really accelerate this greener future that the commission has been talking about.
Jose.
I echo all the comments of the previous speakers. I'll just lead with intentionality. And as we talk about a greener future, we need to be very intentional about how we're working with our youth, making sure our youth from all the communities are prepared with the skill sets and abilities to take on those jobs and careers that are not just here now, but are going to be here in the future. If we can ensure that's diversified and equitable, we can make sure that we're prepared as a region to truly have that greener future that we've talked about. I think the other part about intentionality is really leveraging the data that we have and the collaborative nature of the Sacramento region and identifying those areas that need specific resources. We're really happy. Next week, we're going to be releasing our resources map for the public to use. And hopefully that'll be one tool amongst many to help folks identify the needs and apply the right resources to make sure that we all rise the tide equitably across the entire region. But really being intentional, really being specific, collaborative, and leveraging our specific strengths organizationally, whether it's the private sector, public sector, grassroots, to make sure that we're all engaged in that process. Because once we understand that what happens in Meadowview can be positive for Natomas, can be positive for Folsom, can be positive for Citrus Heights, then we as a region really all grow. And I think that we're in a position to start doing that. And this cross mayor collaboration that you and Mayor Cabaldon started is a great first step.
Thank you so much. Let me just make a couple of closing comments and start by thanking all of you for your time and, more importantly, for your just outstanding leadership, true commitment. Climate is not some esoteric issue that we can put off to the side. It is an equity issue, it's an economic issue, and it's a life and death issue. I mean, the startling statistic that millions of people die from air pollution every year should tell us all we need to know. Preparation for the future is everything, even when you're in the midst of the crisis. 2045 may seem like a long time away, but it really is not. Imagine this. Imagine if 25 years ago that our community, our state, and our country had had a high-profile commission preparing for potential pandemics. We might be a lot better prepared to deal with what we're dealing with now. With climate, all of the warning signs are there and have been there for a long, long time. We've set ourselves some ambitious and aggressive goals, but we also have the benefit of being able to now see the future. And I hope that not just our community, but our country learns the lessons of what we're going through today with the COVID-19 pandemic. There is no substitute for thinking ahead. There is no substitute for preparing for what we know the future is likely to be, and to understand that we can bend the curve, not just in terms of the pandemic, but the future curve around how we choose to live in ways that are healthier, more sustainable, and in ways that are inclusive and just. Happy Earth Day to everybody. And may this be the start of something great for Sacramento, West Sacramento, and our entire region. Really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.